The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes after something terrible. A city block in western Mexico sits under a dim orange sky. Burned buses still smolder in the middle of the road. Storefront windows are shattered, cars abandoned. Streetlights flicker above empty sidewalks. No sirens, no police, no people. Just the distant crackle of flames, slowly eating through rubber and steel. And then, a voice over the radio. Do not leave your homes. Roads are blocked. This is not a drill. Within minutes, entire cities shut down. Schools closed. Hospitals locked their gates. Families dragged furniture against their doors while helicopters circled above neighborhoods that only hours earlier had been filled with traffic, music, and street vendors. But here's the question investigators kept asking. Why burn the city at all? Because the truth is far stranger and far more calculated than anyone realized. The cartels could fight the army. They had the weapons, they had the numbers, and in many regions they even had control. So why would one of the most powerful criminal organizations on Earth suddenly set fire to buses, block highways, and terrorize thousands of civilians who had nothing to do with the conflict? At first glance, it looked like chaos, but investigators studying cartel tactics began to notice something chilling. The fires weren't random, the buses weren't burned by accident, and the cities chosen were never chosen by chance. Every barricade, every hijacked truck, every terrified family trapped inside their homes was part of a strategy designed not to win a battle, but to control an entire country without ever firing a single shot at the military. And if that sounds impossible, consider this. In August of 2022, more than a dozen Mexican cities across several states shut down within hours. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of war, but because a cartel sent a message. The order spread through encrypted chats and burner phones faster than the authorities could react. Block the highways, hijack vehicles, burn everything. Within minutes, masked men began pulling buses to the side of the road. Passengers were forced out. Drivers begged. It didn't matter. Gasoline was poured over the seats, matches were struck, and towering pillars of smoke began rising above the highways like signal flares. Soon, tractor-trailers were set on fire across major intersections. Cars were abandoned mid-traffic as drivers ran for safety. Entire cities froze. Police patrols vanished. Even the military struggled to move. But what made investigators uneasy wasn't the violence. It was the precision. The fires were placed in exactly the right locations to cripple the movement of law enforcement. Major highways, entry points, supply routes. Within a few hours, it became nearly impossible for authorities to move forces between cities. The country wasn't just under attack, it was paralyzed. But here's the unsettling part. None of this was necessary for the cartel to escape. In fact, by the time the fires started, the operation that triggered the chaos had already happened. So why burn the cities after the mission was complete? Why risk global attention? Why terrify millions of civilians? To answer that question, investigators had to go back years to a moment that reshaped the balance of power inside Mexico's underworld. A moment that proved something terrifying. The cartels weren't just criminal gangs anymore. They were learning how to control entire populations through fear. And the technique they perfected was psychological warfare. Because in cartel warfare, killing enemies is expensive. Bullets attract soldiers, battles draw helicopters. But fear spreads faster than gunfire. Fear shuts down cities without a single firefight. And fear forces governments to hesitate. But to understand how this strategy evolved, we need to go back to the night when authorities believed they had finally captured one of the most powerful cartel leaders alive. A night that should have ended with a major victory. Instead, it triggered one of the most shocking displays of cartel power the world had ever seen. The city was Culiacán, a sprawling capital in the state of Sinaloa. A place where organized crime had long blended into daily life.
But on October 17th, 2019, everything changed. That afternoon, Mexican Special Forces launched a quiet operation inside a residential neighborhood. Their target was a man whose name carried enormous weight inside the cartel world. A man who had grown up in the shadow of one of the most infamous drug lords in history. His father was already sitting in a U.S. prison cell, but the family empire was still alive, and authorities believed capturing the son could fracture one of the most powerful organizations in the hemisphere. The operation moved quickly. Armored vehicles surrounded the home. Soldiers forced their way inside. Gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. Within minutes, they had him, handcuffed, under guard. A victory that should have sent shockwaves through the cartel hierarchy. But what happened next stunned even seasoned investigators. Because the moment word spread through cartel networks, the city exploded. Convoys of armed men poured into the streets. Pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns raced through traffic. Roadblocks appeared almost instantly across major intersections. Gunmen surrounded military units. Prisons were attacked. Hundreds of inmates escaped. Cartel fighters began seizing neighborhoods block by block. And then something even more terrifying happened. The fires started. Buses were hijacked. Gas stations were set ablaze. Vehicles burned across highways. The entire city began collapsing into chaos. Families hid inside their homes as machine gun fire echoed through the streets. Smoke darkened the sky above Culiacán. And inside the command center, Mexican officials realized something that had never happened before. They were losing control of a major city to a cartel. But the fires weren't just random violence. They were barriers. Every burning truck blocked a road. Every hijacked bus stopped military reinforcements. Every barricade slowed the army's response. Within hours, cartel fighters had effectively trapped government forces inside pockets of the city. And then the cartel delivered its final message: release him, or the city burns. The demand wasn't whispered. It was broadcast across social media, across radio chatter, across encrypted networks used by cartel commanders. Release him, or thousands more civilians will die. Inside government headquarters, the decision became impossible. Continue fighting and risk turning Culiacán into a battlefield filled with civilians, or release the prisoner, a man responsible for trafficking massive quantities of drugs across international borders, a man whose family empire had fueled decades of violence. The president of Mexico faced a choice few leaders ever confront: protect the rule of law or protect the lives of innocent people trapped inside a war zone. Hours passed. Gunfire continued. The city burned. And then the order was given: release him. Soldiers removed the handcuffs. The prisoner walked free. Cartel fighters melted back into the streets, and the fires slowly died down. But what investigators later discovered would change how authorities understood cartel warfare forever. Because the burning of the city was never about rescuing one man. It was about proving something far more dangerous. If the cartel wanted to, they could shut down an entire city in a matter of hours. And if a government tried to challenge them, they could make the cost unbearable. But that was only the beginning. Because after Culiacán, cartels across Mexico began refining the tactic, burning vehicles, blocking highways, turning cities into prisons of smoke and fear, not to defeat the military, but to control the battlefield before the fight even begins. Investigators would later give these operations a name: narco-blockades. But that term barely captures the reality. Because what happens during these events isn't just a blockade, it's a psychological siege. And the real target is not the army, it's the population. The families watching the flames from their windows, the drivers abandoning their cars on highways, the entire city learning a brutal lesson. The cartel decides when life stops, the cartel decides when it resumes. And every burning bus becomes a signal that resistance has consequences. But even that explanation leaves a deeper question unanswered. Because if the goal is control, why risk destroying cities the cartel also profits from? Why burn the same streets where their own networks operate? Why paralyze the communities that fuel their own economy? To answer that question, investigators had to examine dozens of incidents across multiple states. Patterns began to emerge. The fires always appeared during key moments: arrests, military raids, internal cartel conflicts. It was never random, it was always timed, which led analysts to a disturbing conclusion. Burning cities wasn't an act of desperation, it was a message designed to reach three very specific audiences: the government, rival cartels, and the public.
But the most important audience was watching from Washington. Because every time a cartel demonstrated this level of power, pressure mounted on U.S. authorities to intervene. And intervention meant something cartels understood very well: more attention, more military support, more investigations. So the strategy had to be carefully balanced. Enough chaos to send a message, but not enough to trigger a full-scale crackdown. And that delicate balance revealed something investigators rarely say out loud. Cartel violence isn't random. It's managed, calculated, engineered, like a dark form of public relations. Each fire, a headline; each blockade, a warning; each shutdown, a reminder of who really controls the streets. But the tactic evolved even further, because once cartels realized cities could be paralyzed with a handful of burning vehicles, they began using the strategy offensively. Not just to defend their leaders, but to attack rivals. Entire regions could be locked down, transport routes destroyed, police distracted, all while rival groups struggled to move supplies through roads filled with smoke and wreckage. In other words, burning the city wasn't collateral damage, it was the weapon. And in the years following the Culiacán crisis, investigators began documenting something even more disturbing. The tactic was spreading. Different cartels, different regions, but the same playbook: hijack vehicles, block highways, burn everything. Control the narrative, control the fear, control the city. And the deeper analysts looked into these operations, the more unsettling the pattern became. Because behind every burning bus, there was always a command, a single decision, issued somewhere far from the smoke, a voice on a phone, a message on an encrypted app, an order that would transform a normal city into a battlefield within minutes. But the identity of the people giving those orders and the real reason they rely on this strategy reveals a hidden layer of cartel warfare most civilians never see. A layer where violence isn't about rage or revenge or chaos. It's about power. And in that world, fire is just another tool, a signal, a warning, a demonstration. But the most chilling discovery investigators made came from a former cartel insider, someone who had helped coordinate these operations from behind the scenes. When authorities finally questioned him about the burning cities, they expected to hear about military strategy, escape routes, or defensive tactics. Instead, he explained something far simpler. The goal wasn't to defeat the government. The goal was to make the government afraid to fight. Because if leaders knew that every operation would trigger chaos, every arrest would shut down cities, every raid would put thousands of civilians at risk, then sooner or later, the government would hesitate. And hesitation is victory. But that revelation raised another terrifying possibility. What if the fires weren't just reactions to government pressure? What if they were rehearsals? Demonstrations of power designed to show exactly how much control cartels could exert over entire regions. If that's true, then the burning cities we see on the news may only be the visible surface of something much larger. A strategy that has been quietly evolving for years. A strategy designed not just to intimidate authorities, but to reshape the balance of power across Mexico itself. And if investigators are right, then the real battlefield isn't the streets where the fires burn.
It's the decisions being made inside government offices, where leaders must decide whether enforcing the law is worth the risk of watching another city go up in flames. Because once a cartel proves it can shut down an entire city, the threat doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting for the next arrest, the next raid, the next moment when someone in power has to choose between confronting the cartel or letting the streets burn again. And that choice may reveal the real reason cartels don't fight their wars with bullets. They fight them with fear. And fear can spread faster than fire. For years, investigators believed the fires were nothing more than a desperate reaction. A cartel leader gets arrested, authorities move in, the organization panics, vehicles burn, cities shut down. But as intelligence analysts began comparing dozens of these incidents across Mexico, a very different picture emerged. Because the fires always appeared in the same pattern, the same timing, the same locations, and the same outcome.
Police immobilized, military delayed, civilians terrified, the government forced to make impossible decisions. What looked like chaos was actually choreography. And the more investigators studied it, the clearer the strategy became. Because burning a city is not just about blocking roads, it's about controlling time. Every burning truck buys minutes. Every hijacked bus delays reinforcements. Every barricade forces the government to move slower. And in cartel warfare, time is everything, especially when authorities are trying to capture someone important. Take the example of the man whose arrest triggered the chaos in Culiacán, Ovidio Guzman Lopez, the son of the infamous drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. His capture in 2019 should have been a turning point. Instead, it exposed something Mexican authorities had underestimated for years: the speed of cartel response. Within minutes of his arrest, messages were already spreading through encrypted networks used by the Sinaloa cartel. Commanders issued instructions, local cells mobilized. Drivers were told exactly where to go, which highways to block, which intersections to shut down, which vehicles to burn. This was not spontaneous violence. It was an organized protocol. Investigators later discovered that some cartel groups maintain what insiders call contingency playbooks, pre-planned responses triggered the moment authorities move against key leaders. If a commander is arrested, Operation Blockade begins. If a rival group invades, Operation Blockade begins. If military raids threaten cartel infrastructure, Operation Blockade begins. The tactic is simple: paralyze the region faster than the government can respond. But there's another layer to the strategy, because the burning vehicles don't just slow down soldiers, they change the battlefield entirely. Modern cities depend on mobility. Ambulances, police, military convoys, emergency responders, all of them rely on open roads. The moment highways are blocked with burning trucks, the entire response system collapses. Police units become isolated, military forces struggle to coordinate, emergency services disappear, and suddenly the cartel controls the tempo of the crisis. But the real genius of the strategy lies somewhere else, in the psychology of fear. Because every burning vehicle sends a message far beyond the flames, a message to civilians, a message to local police, and most importantly, a message to politicians. The message is simple: if you try to arrest our leaders, we will make the entire country pay the price. And the tactic works, because governments operate under a different set of rules than criminal organizations. Cartels can embrace chaos, governments cannot. Authorities must worry about civilian casualties, economic disruption, international headlines, political fallout. Every burning bus becomes a political problem. Every highway blockade becomes a national crisis. And the longer the chaos continues, the more pressure builds on government leaders to stop it, even if stopping it means backing down. That's exactly what happened in Culiacán. After hours of escalating violence, the Mexican government made a decision that stunned the world. They released the prisoner, the man authorities had risked everything to capture, Ovidio Guzman Lopez. The official explanation was simple: prevent further bloodshed, protect civilian lives. But inside intelligence circles, analysts understood what had just happened. The cartel had demonstrated something unprecedented. They had forced a government to retreat, not with superior firepower, but with controlled chaos. It was a proof of concept, and once the tactic proved successful, other cartels took notice. One of the most aggressive adopters of this strategy was the rapidly rising organization known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Unlike older cartels that relied on secrecy and corruption, CJNG built its reputation on open displays of power. Convoys of armored vehicles, heavily armed fighters, propaganda videos showing military-style formations. But even they recognized the power of narco-blockades, because shutting down a city sends a message no propaganda video ever could. It proves control. And control is the most valuable currency in the criminal underworld. The more regions a cartel can dominate, the easier it becomes to move drugs, weapons, and money. Roads become supply lines, cities become logistical hubs. And when authorities threaten those networks, the response must be immediate. Over the years, investigators began mapping incidents of city shutdowns across Mexico, and the data revealed something chilling. These events were becoming more frequent, more organized, and more geographically strategic. Highways linking major trafficking corridors, border routes, port cities, transportation hubs. Every blockade seemed to appear exactly where it would cause the greatest disruption. But investigators also noticed another pattern. The fires rarely lasted very long, just long enough to send a message, just long enough to dominate the headlines. Then the cartel fighters vanished, the roads slowly reopened, life resumed, as if the city had briefly stepped into a nightmare and then awakened. But the memory remained. Residents remembered the smoke, the gunfire, the helpless feeling of watching their city shut down in a matter of hours. And that memory became a powerful tool, because fear doesn't disappear when the fires go out. It lingers, waiting. The next time authorities attempt a raid, the next time soldiers move into a neighborhood, everyone knows what could happen next. The streets could burn again. But the deeper investigators looked into this tactic, the more they realized something even more unsettling. Narco-blockades weren't just defensive, they were also offensive. Cartels had begun using city shutdowns to attack their rivals. Imagine two criminal organizations fighting for control of a region.
One group launches a series of blockades across highways. The entire transportation network collapses. Police are overwhelmed responding to fires and barricades. Meanwhile, their rivals' supply routes are cut off. Drug shipments stall. Communication breaks down. Reinforcements cannot move. In other words, burning the city becomes a strategic weapon, a way to control territory without fighting street battles. But there is still another reason cartels rely on this tactic, a reason rarely discussed outside intelligence briefings. Because burning vehicles accomplish something that bullets cannot. They erase evidence. When gunfights erupt between cartels and authorities, forensic investigators can analyze the scene. Ballistics, weapons, shell casings, DNA. But when vehicles burn, everything disappears. Fingerprints, weapons, surveillance traces. The fire consumes it all. Investigators are left with charred metal and melted glass. The perpetrators vanish into the city. Another crisis without clear suspects. Another attack without accountability. And that brings us to the most unsettling question of all. Who actually gives the order to burn the city? Because while the violence happens on the streets, the decisions are made somewhere else, often far away from the flames. Former cartel members who have cooperated with authorities describe a strict command structure behind these operations. Orders travel through layers of trusted lieutenants, encrypted messaging apps, burner phones that disappear after a single call. And when the command arrives, the response is immediate. Drivers move, lookouts activate, cells deploy across the city like pieces on a chessboard. Within minutes, vehicles are seized, roads are blocked, and fires begin rising across the skyline.
For civilians watching from their homes, it feels like chaos. But inside cartel networks, it is something very different. Coordination, planning, execution. And the people orchestrating these operations understand something fundamental about power. You don't have to control every street. You only have to prove that you can. Because once that reputation is established, fear does the rest. Police hesitate, politicians delay, communities stay silent, and rivals think twice before challenging your territory. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if burning cities isn't just a reaction to pressure? What if it's a demonstration, a reminder, a message broadcast across the entire country? Look what we can do. Look how quickly life can stop. Look how easily the system can break. And if that's the real purpose of these fires, then every blockade becomes more than a tactical move. It becomes a psychological broadcast, a display of authority. Because power isn't just about violence, it's about perception. If people believe you control the streets, then in many ways you already do. And that may explain why the tactic continues to spread, even after international attention, even after military crackdowns, even after arrests of cartel leaders. Because the strategy works, it reshapes the battlefield, and it forces governments into a dilemma with no easy answer. If authorities push too aggressively, cities burn. If they hesitate, cartels grow stronger. Either way, the streets remain under the shadow of organizations that have mastered one of the oldest tactics in warfare. Not overwhelming force, not massive armies, but something far more effective: fear. Because when fear spreads through a city, doors close, phones go silent, people disappear from the streets. And suddenly, without firing a single shot, an entire population becomes controlled. That is the hidden reason cartels burn cities instead of fighting. Because they don't need to win battles, they only need to prove they can shut the world down whenever they choose. And once that belief takes hold, the fire no longer has to burn. The threat alone becomes enough. Enough to silence witnesses, enough to freeze entire communities, enough to make governments pause before acting. Which means the most powerful weapon in cartel warfare is not the gun, it's the memory of the flames. By the time the fires die out, the people responsible are usually gone. No arrests, no suspects standing beside burned vehicles, just blackened metal skeletons scattered across highways and a city slowly returning to life. For investigators, the aftermath is always the same: ash, smoke, and questions. Because the real architects of these shutdowns rarely appear in the chaos they create. They operate somewhere else, behind phones, behind encrypted messages, behind layers of loyalty and fear that shield them from the flames they order to ignite. And to understand how this system actually works, investigators had to focus on something rarely discussed in public reports: the cartel logistics network. Because burning a city requires far more than angry gunmen with gasoline. It requires infrastructure, people assigned to very specific roles: drivers, lookouts, communication coordinators, even mechanics. Every piece of the operation must function within minutes of receiving the order, otherwise the entire strategy collapses. Authorities began to notice something unusual about many narco-blockade incidents. The vehicles used in the fires were rarely random. Often they were carefully chosen: public buses, cargo trucks, construction equipment, vehicles large enough to block multiple lanes of traffic. Large enough to shut down an entire highway with a single ignition. Which meant cartel cells had to identify these vehicles in advance, track them, intercept them, and position them exactly where they would cause maximum disruption. Former cartel insiders later revealed how these preparations actually happen. In many cities under cartel influence, local cells maintain what they call reaction vehicles. Vehicles already identified as potential barricades. Delivery trucks, municipal buses, even private transport companies whose routes pass through key intersections. Lookouts monitor these routes daily. They know where the drivers stop. They know which highways carry the heaviest traffic. They know exactly which intersections can paralyze a city if blocked. And when the command arrives, those vehicles become weapons. Drivers are forced out. Fuel is poured. The barricade is lit. Within minutes, the city begins to freeze. But there is another layer investigators discovered while studying these operations, something even more sophisticated. Cartels rarely rely on a single blockade. They create dozens, simultaneously, across multiple neighborhoods, across multiple highways, which overwhelms authorities immediately. Police units cannot respond everywhere at once. Firefighters struggle to reach the flames. Military convoys are forced to reroute again and again. By the time a road clears, another one ignites. The city becomes a maze of fire and smoke. And that confusion is exactly the point. Because confusion buys time. Time for leaders to escape. Time for contraband to disappear. Time for cartel commanders to reposition their forces. But sometimes the objective isn't escape at all. Sometimes the goal is intimidation. One intelligence analyst studying cartel communications explained it this way. When they burn the city, they're not hiding, they're performing. Performing for three audiences: the government, rival organizations, and the public. Each group sees something different in the flames. For government officials, the fires signal a warning. Push too far, and the country will burn. For rival cartels, the message is dominance. We control this territory. And for civilians, the signal is something far simpler. Stay out of the way. Because once the fires begin, the rules of normal life no longer apply. Shops close, schools lock their gates, hospitals prepare for casualties. Entire neighborhoods fall silent as residents retreat indoors. The city becomes a ghost landscape of sirens and smoke. But the deeper investigators looked into these shutdowns, the more they realized something disturbing. Many of the people setting the fires are not hardened cartel soldiers. They're teenagers, street recruits, low-level operatives who receive a phone call and a promise of quick cash. Sometimes the payment is as little as a few $100s, enough to convince someone with few options to hijack a vehicle and strike a match. These recruits are expendable. If they're arrested, the cartel loses nothing. If they escape, the mission succeeds, and the commanders who issued the order remain invisible. Which makes dismantling the strategy incredibly difficult. Because authorities are not fighting a single army, they're fighting a network that blends into everyday life. Drivers, construction workers, taxi operators, mechanics, lookouts stationed on rooftops with radios, every piece of the system waiting quietly until the command arrives. And when it does, the city changes in minutes. But there is still another factor that makes narco-blockades so effective, something investigators rarely discuss publicly: information control. Because during these shutdowns, rumors spread faster than the fires themselves. Social media floods with videos: burning trucks, masked gunmen, explosions on distant highways. Some footage is real, some is recycled from older events, some is intentionally spread by cartel sympathizers to amplify the fear. But to civilians watching from their homes, the distinction hardly matters. All they see is a city collapsing.
And the psychological effect multiplies the chaos. Even neighborhoods far from the violence begin shutting down. Businesses close, drivers abandon the streets. Authorities struggle to determine which threats are real and which are rumors. In many ways, the digital panic becomes as powerful as the fires themselves. Cartels understand this, which is why some groups actively encourage the spread of these videos. Fear is contagious, and the more frightening the footage appears, the more control the cartel gains without firing a shot. But the most chilling discovery investigators made came from studying how these operations end. Because narco-blockades rarely continue indefinitely. Eventually, the fires stop, the roads reopen, and cartel fighters disappear, almost as quickly as they arrived. Which means someone, somewhere, decides when the chaos begins and when it ends. That level of coordination suggests something many authorities hesitate to admit publicly.
Cartels now operate with command structures that resemble military organizations. Regional commanders, communication networks, operational protocols, rapid response teams, and strategic planning that extends far beyond individual cities. In fact, intelligence reports suggest some cartels can activate blockade operations across multiple states within hours, a capability that transforms them from criminal gangs into something far more powerful, a parallel force capable of challenging government control over entire regions. And that reality raises a question few officials are comfortable answering. What happens if the strategy escalates? What happens if the fires spread across multiple major cities at the same time? Some analysts believe cartels have already tested this possibility. Coordinated shutdowns in different states, multiple highways burning simultaneously, a patchwork of smoke columns visible from satellites. So far, these events have been limited, brief, contained, but they reveal something unsettling. The system works, and the cartels know it. Because every successful shutdown strengthens the myth of their power. Every time a city freezes in fear, their reputation grows. And reputation is a weapon. In the criminal underworld, perception often matters more than force. If people believe you can shut down a city, you may never need to prove it again. The threat alone becomes enough. Enough to influence elections, enough to silence journalists, enough to convince police officers to look the other way. Because everyone remembers the flames, the smoke, the night the streets went silent. But there is still one final layer to this strategy that investigators continue to study: the financial motive. Because while burning vehicles might seem destructive, the long-term impact can actually strengthen cartel control. When businesses close during these shutdowns, many suffer enormous losses. Supply chains break, deliveries stop. Tourism collapses, local economies weaken. And in regions where cartels already operate shadow economies, those disruptions can push struggling communities further into dependence on criminal networks. Illegal work, smuggling, protection payments. In other words, the fires don't just paralyze cities, they reshape them, slowly shifting power away from the state and toward the organizations willing to ignite the streets. Which means every narco-blockade is more than a moment of violence. It's part of a long-term strategy, a strategy designed to prove something over and over again. The government may claim authority, but when the fires start, the cartels decide what happens next. And that realization leaves authorities facing one of the most difficult challenges in modern law enforcement. How do you stop an enemy that doesn't need to win battles? How do you defeat an organization that uses fear instead of territory? Because when cities can be shut down with a handful of burning vehicles, the battlefield is no longer the streets. It's the minds of the people living there. And as long as the memory of those fires remains, the cartels may not need to burn another city at all. The threat alone might be enough. Enough to keep entire regions under control. Enough to make governments hesitate. Enough to ensure that the next time someone tries to challenge them, everyone remembers exactly what happened the last time the streets caught fire. By the time the smoke clears, the story usually disappears. News crews pack their equipment, helicopters leave the sky. Traffic slowly returns to the highways where burned trucks once blocked the road. To an outsider, it can look like the crisis simply ended. But for the people who live there, the real impact begins after the fires go out. Because a city that has been shut down by cartel violence never fully returns to normal. The fear stays. In the quiet way people glance over their shoulders when motorcycles pass. In the sudden silence when conversations drift too close to the subject of organized crime. In the unspoken understanding that the next shutdown could happen at any time. Residents in cities that have experienced narco-blockades often describe the same moment, the moment that everything changes. 1 minute the streets are alive with traffic, street vendors calling to customers, children walking home from school. Then suddenly the messages begin appearing. Text alerts, WhatsApp groups, social media warnings spreading from phone to phone. Don't go outside, something is happening, roads are blocked. Within minutes the entire rhythm of the city shifts. Businesses pull down metal shutters. Drivers turn around in the middle of the street. Parents rush to schools to retrieve their children. and somewhere in the distance, smoke begins rising above the skyline. For investigators studying these events, that rapid transformation is the most revealing part, because it shows how deeply cartel power has embedded itself into everyday life. People don't wait for official warnings, they trust the rumors first, because experience has taught them something important. When the fires begin, the authorities often arrive too late. But the long-term consequences extend far beyond fear. Entire industries can collapse overnight when cartel shutdowns become frequent. Tourism disappears. Investors move their money elsewhere. Small businesses close their doors permanently after losing days or weeks of income. Local economies begin to shrink. And in that vacuum, criminal organizations quietly expand their influence. In many regions, cartels already operate underground economies that rival legitimate businesses. Transportation networks, fuel distribution, agriculture, construction. When legal commerce weakens, these shadow systems grow stronger, which means every city shutdown can shift economic power further toward the cartels. But the damage isn't only financial, it's institutional. Police officers stationed in regions plagued by narco-blockades often face an impossible dilemma: confront heavily armed cartel cells or protect civilians trapped in the chaos. Many officers know that responding aggressively could trigger more violence, more fires, more retaliation. So sometimes they hesitate, and that hesitation becomes part of the cartel's strategy, because every moment of uncertainty erodes public confidence in the state. If residents believe authorities cannot protect them, they begin seeking protection somewhere else. In some cases, that means turning to the very organizations responsible for the violence. Cartels often present themselves as alternative power structures. They resolve disputes, provide money to struggling families, offer employment in regions where legitimate opportunities are scarce. It is a paradox that investigators have struggled to explain for decades. The same organizations capable of burning cities also attempt to portray themselves as guardians of the communities they control. But this dual identity serves a purpose, because power built on fear alone is unstable. Fear creates obedience, but loyalty requires something else: dependence. And the more communities rely on cartel-controlled economies, the harder it becomes for authorities to dismantle those networks. But even this explanation doesn't fully capture the complexity of what happens after a city burns, because sometimes the most powerful consequences unfold quietly, inside government offices, inside military planning rooms, inside political debates where leaders must decide how far they are willing to go in confronting organized crime. The events in Culiacán during 2019 forced Mexican authorities to confront a reality that had been building for years. The capture and release of Ovidio Guzmán López during the crisis now known as the Culiacanazo became a defining moment. For some critics, the decision to release him represented a dangerous precedent, a signal that cartels could pressure the government into retreat. For others, the choice reflected a grim calculation: saving civilian lives in the middle of an unfolding urban battle. But regardless of perspective, the incident changed how both sides approached the conflict. Authorities began developing new strategies designed to prevent cartel shutdowns before they begin. Military intelligence units expanded their surveillance of cartel communication networks. Special forces units trained for faster urban responses. And federal authorities began coordinating more closely with local police forces. But cartels adapted as well. They changed communication methods, shifted leadership structures, and refined the tactics used during narco-blockades. Some groups began deploying smaller, more mobile units capable of igniting fires and disappearing within minutes. Others experimented with simultaneous shutdowns across multiple cities to overwhelm authorities. The conflict evolved into something far more complicated than a simple war between criminals and the state. It became a strategic contest over control of time, information, and perception. And nowhere is that contest more visible than in the way cities respond today when rumors of cartel violence begin to spread. In many places, residents now instinctively monitor social media channels that track cartel activity. Community networks share real-time updates about roadblocks and shootings. Parents coordinate school pickups through group messages. Taxi drivers exchange warnings about dangerous intersections. Entire populations have developed informal systems of survival, adapting to a reality where sudden shutdowns have become part of life. But the most troubling question remains unanswered. What happens if the tactic escalates further? Because so far, narco-blockades have largely targeted individual cities or regions, but intelligence analysts warn that the underlying infrastructure behind these operations could support something much larger. Coordinated shutdowns across multiple major urban centers, highways blocked simultaneously across several states, supply chains disrupted across an entire national economy. This is why some security experts now view narco-blockades as a form of asymmetric warfare, a tactic designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of modern urban life. And while the images of burning buses and hijacked trucks may appear chaotic, they are often part of a carefully calculated strategy, one that relies less on brute force and more on the manipulation of fear. Because fear can travel through a city faster than any convoy. It spreads through whispers, through videos shared across thousands of phones, through memories of past nights when the streets filled with smoke. And once that fear becomes embedded in a population, the cartels no longer need to prove their power every day. The reputation alone becomes enough. Enough to keep businesses closed at the first rumor of trouble. Enough to keep witnesses silent. Enough to influence decisions made in government offices far from the streets where the fires once burned. Which brings us back to the question that began this investigation. Why do cartels burn cities instead of fighting? The answer is both simple and deeply unsettling. Because burning a city is not just an act of violence, it is a demonstration, a signal broadcast to millions of people at once, a reminder that the balance of power in certain regions remains fragile, and that under the right circumstances, a handful of coordinated fires can bring an entire city to a standstill. For the residents who have lived through these shutdowns, the lesson is unforgettable. The night the buses burned, the highways filled with smoke, the moment when ordinary life suddenly stopped, and in the quiet hours that followed, when the flames finally faded and the streets fell silent again, one realization lingered in the air. The fires may have gone out, but the power behind them never disappeared. Long after the smoke disappears, the question remains: who truly controls the city? On paper, the answer is simple. Police patrol the streets. Government buildings remain open. Courts continue operating. The flag still flies above city halls and military bases.
But in regions where narco-blockades have become part of daily life, the reality can feel very different. Because control isn't only measured by who occupies the streets, it's measured by who can stop them. And the ability to bring an entire city to a halt, sometimes within minutes, has quietly shifted the balance of power in ways that few outside observers fully understand. To investigators, the fires represent more than isolated moments of violence. They are signals that reveal how organized crime has evolved. Cartels today are not simply smuggling organizations moving narcotics across borders. They are complex systems of influence, networks capable of shaping economies, politics, and entire communities. And the tactic of burning cities is just one visible piece of a much larger strategy. Because behind every narco-blockade lies something even more powerful than intimidation: information. Cartels study the regions they control with remarkable precision. They know which roads carry the most traffic, which highways link major industrial corridors, which ports handle valuable shipments, which neighborhoods house government officials.
This information allows them to identify pressure points inside the modern city, places where a single disruption can trigger widespread paralysis. And when those pressure points ignite, the impact spreads far beyond the flames. Supply chains stall, factories halt production, food deliveries fail to reach grocery stores, hospitals struggle to receive medical supplies. Entire systems built on movement begin to break down. Even if the shutdown lasts only a few hours, the economic shock can ripple for days, and that ripple sends a powerful message, a reminder that modern cities are far more fragile than they appear. But perhaps the most chilling element of this strategy is how quietly it operates. Because narco-blockades rarely require large armies. A handful of coordinated cells can accomplish what once required hundreds of fighters. A truck driver forced from his vehicle, a few gallons of gasoline, a single intersection blocked at the right moment. Multiply that across a dozen locations, and the entire city freezes. And yet, despite the scale of the disruption, the individuals responsible often vanish before authorities arrive. Firefighters extinguish flames without encountering the people who lit them. Investigators collect fragments of evidence from charred wreckage, but the chain of command remains hidden. Which makes one fact painfully clear. Narco-blockades are not designed to win battles. They are designed to avoid them. Because direct confrontation with military forces carries enormous risks for criminal organizations. But fear can achieve the same objective without sustained fighting. It can immobilize authorities, discourage investigations, and convince entire communities that resistance is futile. Over time, this psychological pressure reshapes behavior across entire regions. Businesses quietly pay protection fees rather than risk retaliation. Truck drivers adjust their routes to avoid areas where blockades frequently occur. Local officials learn which conflicts are safer left alone. Bit by bit, the lines between legal authority and criminal influence begin to blur. And when that happens, cartels gain something far more valuable than territory. They gain predictability. They know how officials will react. They know which operations will provoke shutdowns, and they know exactly how much pressure is required to force hesitation. But even the most powerful systems built on fear carry a hidden weakness. Fear must be maintained. If the flames disappear for too long, if communities begin to feel safe again, the reputation begins to fade. And reputation is the foundation of cartel power. Which is why narco-blockades appear again and again across different regions. Not constantly, not every week, just often enough to remind everyone that the capability still exists. A burned truck here, a hijacked bus there, a few hours of chaos that ripple across the national news cycle. Then silence. Then normal life resumes. Until the next time. But the world outside Mexico has begun paying closer attention to these tactics, because the implications stretch far beyond cartel violence alone. Security experts studying organized crime in other regions have noticed similar patterns emerging in different forms. Criminal networks exploiting infrastructure, using targeted disruptions to exert pressure on governments, turning transportation systems into leverage. What once appeared to be a uniquely Mexican phenomenon may actually represent a broader shift in how non-state actors challenge modern governments. And that possibility raises difficult questions for policymakers and law enforcement agencies across the world. How do you defend cities against enemies who do not need to hold territory? How do you prevent crises triggered by a few coordinated acts of sabotage? And perhaps most importantly, how do you stop the spread of fear once it has already taken root? Because fear is a weapon unlike any other. It doesn't need ammunition, it doesn't need a large army, and once it spreads through a population, it becomes almost impossible to measure. But the most haunting insight comes from people who have lived through these shutdowns. Residents who watched their cities burn, who heard the helicopters overhead, who waited inside their homes while sirens echoed through smoke-filled streets. Many described the same realization, the moment they understood the true purpose of the fires. It wasn't about destroying the city. It was about showing that it could be destroyed, that the fragile systems holding modern life together could collapse in hours if the wrong people decided to light a match. And once that realization settles into the public consciousness, the flames no longer need to appear every day. The memory becomes enough. Enough to shape behavior, enough to influence decisions, enough to keep entire communities living under an invisible shadow. A shadow cast not just by the fires themselves, but by the knowledge that they could return at any moment. And that is the hidden reason cartels burn cities instead of fighting. Because the most effective wars are not always fought with bullets. Sometimes they are fought with perception, with intimidation, with carefully calculated displays of power that ripple through society long after the smoke disappears. In those moments, the battlefield is no longer the streets where the vehicles burned.
And in certain regions, investigators believe cartels maintain entire reserve units dedicated solely to rapid response blockades, teams that exist for one purpose alone: to shut down the city when the order comes. If these assessments are correct, it means the infrastructure behind narco-blockades is becoming more sophisticated over time, more organized, more integrated into the broader operations of cartel networks. And that evolution raises an unsettling possibility. The fires we see today may only represent the early stages of a much larger strategy. Because if criminal organizations can repeatedly paralyze cities with limited manpower, imagine what could happen if those tactics expand. Multiple cities igniting simultaneously, entire transportation corridors collapsing, regional economies freezing under waves of coordinated disruption. For governments already struggling to contain organized crime, such scenarios represent a serious national security concern. But even in the face of these risks, investigators remain cautious about drawing dramatic conclusions, because the truth about cartel warfare is often more complicated than headlines suggest. Yes, cartels possess the ability to shut down cities. Yes, narco-blockades demonstrate alarming levels of coordination. But the organizations behind these operations also rely on secrecy, mobility, and calculated restraint. They do not seek open war with the state. Open war invites overwhelming retaliation. Instead, they operate in the shadows between confrontation and avoidance, applying pressure when necessary, retreating when the spotlight grows too bright, maintaining control through carefully managed displays of power. And that delicate balance may explain why the fires burn only occasionally, why the shutdowns rarely last longer than a few hours, why the violence erupts suddenly and then disappears. The spectacle serves its purpose, the message spreads, and the city slowly returns to life. But beneath that return to normalcy lies a reality investigators understand all too well. The system that created the fires has not disappeared. The networks remain in place. The vehicles that could become barricades still travel the roads. The operatives who ignited those flames still live among the population, waiting, watching, listening for the next command. Because somewhere within the hidden communication channels of cartel leadership, the possibility always exists. A new arrest, a new conflict, a new decision made in a quiet room far from the highways. And when that decision is made, when the message moves through the network and reaches the people assigned to act, the city may once again face the same transformation. Traffic slowing, rumors spreading, smoke rising above distant intersections. Another night when ordinary life pauses under the shadow of burning streets. Another reminder that the real battlefield in cartel warfare is not always fought with bullets. Sometimes it begins with something much simpler: a truck pulled across the road, a can of gasoline, and a single match. But the fires, the roadblocks, the abandoned streets, those aren't just moments of chaos. They are warnings. Warnings that somewhere in the shadows decisions are being made that can bring an entire city to a standstill within minutes. And the most unsettling part is this: many of these operations are never fully explained, never fully solved, and sometimes never even officially acknowledged.
which means the story doesn't end when the flames go out. Because behind every burning highway, every silent city, and every sudden shutdown, there are deeper strategies, hidden players, and secrets that most people never hear about. And that's exactly what this channel exists to uncover. So if you want to see the investigations most people never talk about, the hidden tactics behind cartel power, and the stories that explain what's really happening behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next documentary might reveal something even more disturbing. And once you see it, you'll never look at these headlines the same way again.